Calvin's first love chased after him relentlessly once he came back to the country. He assured me that he would handle it, but when his first love had an accident, it was he who left me without hesitation. I'm sorry, Nina. I can't just ignore her. Later, he received the police report and finally remembered to come find me. Little did he know, I had already left for good. Sherry had been tangled with Calvin for quite a while. That night, on my birthday, she called Calvin again from a different number, crying uncontrollably. Calvin, I miss you so much. I really regret leaving you back then. Can I see you just once? I couldn't help but look at Calvin. He seemed to take a second longer to react before turning off his phone. She and I are already a thing of the past. Don't take it to heart. I'll handle this matter, he said. His brows were furrowed, his eyes lowered, and his expression was indifferent. Yet he didn't realize how distracted he looked. He took sip after sip of his red wine, frequently glancing at his phone. It was clear I was the main character of this date. Perhaps it wasn't his fault, I thought. Sherry had once been such a proud and radiant person, unwilling to bow her head to anyone. Now, returning to my homeland felt like becoming a different person, shedding all my pride just to seek a change of heart from him. The feeling of frustration spread in my chest as I pulled out my phone, restraining myself. Calvin, if you're really worried, why don't you go see her? I can call a chauffeur for you. Calvin froze, and I gripped my phone tightly, suddenly feeling the urge to leave. But he forcefully pulled me back. He stared at me for a long time before smiling. Sorry, Nina, I overlooked your feelings. Give me a little more time with Sherry. I promise I won't let her cause a scene in front of us again. I pressed my lips together, meeting Calvin's gentle and sincere gaze. I wanted to respond with understanding, saying, okay. But then another phone call pulled me back into the cold reality. Hello, may I ask if this is Mr. Calvin? Before Calvin could even finish listening, he suddenly stood up and knocked over the wine glass. Everyone around knew that Calvin and Sherry were childhood sweethearts, coming from similar backgrounds and having been together since college. Later, when Calvin's family situation changed, Sherry decided to break up and go abroad alone. The night she left was the first time I saw Calvin so disheveled. His eyes were bloodshot, drenched in the heavy rain, with the smell of alcohol clinging to him, one that could never be washed away. He dialed that phone over and over, but it was always unanswered. When he looked up and then saw me standing in front of him, his emotions instantly collapsed. Nah, he exclaimed, hugging me tightly. I can't believe it's you. How could it be you? It wasn't Sherry who came. And his disappointment was clear. At that moment, my mind was in a whirlwind, and I never imagined he would remember my name. After university, I joined his company on my own and became his subordinate. We worked together day and night, supporting each other through the toughest times the company faced. During a social gathering, Calvin drank so much that he ended up with a stomach bleed, and I had to carry him to the hospital. When he woke up, his gaze fell on me. Nah, do you like me? I'm not good at lying, nor did I want to hide it. I nodded and admitted, yes. Over the years, I had seen many women try to get close to Calvin, but he had never shown them any pretense or mercy. I thought that would be the last time our paths crossed. On the day of my discharge, just as we were about to part ways, Calvin took my hand. His eyes revealed a seriousness I had never seen before. "Nina, how about we give it a try?" Under Calvin's persistent advances, I compromised. After all, who can resist someone they've secretly loved for years? But now, when I think about it, if Sherry hadn't gone abroad back then, I probably wouldn't have had this chance. Sherry returned on the day of the class reunion after Calvin and I finished work. We arrived to hear the crowd dispersing in laughter. "Na is just a crazy pursuer," someone said. During Calvin's junior year, when his family had trouble, she crazily pursued him for 2 years, following him everywhere, almost serving him closely. Everyone saw this. I stood frozen, my expression stiff. Calvin was the first to react, his face darkening as he grabbed the person speaking. "Who do you think you are to speak ill of Nina? What are you even worth?" He swung his fist, about to strike the person, but a pure white hand stopped him. Calvin looked over, and Sherry had already risen from the crowd, a familiar smile on her lips. "Calvin, it's been almost 5 years since we parted, but you're still the same, reckless and impulsive." I clearly saw that Calvin seemed like a malfunctioning machine, devoid of any response. Sherry glanced at him and then turned to me in surprise. "Nina, you've changed so much. You're way more beautiful than in college. I almost didn't recognize you." I wasn't that bad to begin with. It's just that during university, I was too focused on working part-time and studying hard, leaving no time to take care of my appearance. I replied calmly, concealing my inner turmoil. But Calvin firmly held me around the waist, ruffling the top of my head. He looked at me with unreserved tenderness. "Yes, Nina is very beautiful, with a gentle temperament and a kind heart. After university, I pursued her for over a year before she finally agreed." At that moment, I felt very touched, naively thinking Calvin was standing up for me in front of everyone. The next moment, he said indifferently, "Unlike some people who prioritize family interests above all else and only weigh the pros and cons, there's no sincerity at all." The warmth in my heart was suddenly extinguished, and I stood there. Sherry also laughed out loud. Her gaze recklessly landed on my face, with a hint of amusement. "Well, you've really worked hard all these years, haven't you, Mina? To be honest, in the 3 years we've been together, Calvin has treated me quite well." So, when the party ended that day and Calvin apologized to me in the car, I didn't blame him. "It's okay, after all. You used to be in a relationship. If you had no reaction at all, I would find that strange." Calvin was taken aback by my words. The dim light in the car made his expression seem odd. He lowered his eyelids, and after a long while, raised a meaningful smile. I didn't expect my girlfriend to be so understanding. It was from that day that my relationship with Calvin began to change. Sherry almost forcefully intervened in the relationship between the two of us. I had organized a private outing with Calvin when she suddenly appeared from behind him. She blinked and apologized, saying, "Sorry, nah, I really don't have other friends here, so I wanted to be with you. Is that okay?" Seeing the subtle challenge in Cher's eyes, The words, "I mind," almost escaped my lips, but Calvin, who had remained quiet until then, intervened. "It's fine. It's just a meal. She's not that petty," he said, raising an eyebrow and looking at me. "Right, Mina?" His calm demeanor and composed tone made me feel as though refusing would be the wrong choice, as though I was the one not being understanding. I didn't respond, and unexpectedly, Cher's carefree attitude took over. From that point on, whether we were on dates, shopping, or even at the office, Cher's presence was always felt. She joked with my boyfriend as if no one else was around, visited his office, and even prepared lunch for him during busy days. One time I walked into the office to see Cher pretending to fall into Calvin's arms, tightly holding his waist, while Calvin didn't push her away. At that moment, the emotions I had kept suppressed for so long boiled over. I slammed the documents in my hand onto the table, clenched my fists, and turned to leave. Behind me, I heard the rush of footsteps and Cher's anxious calls. My mind became a blur, and I hurried out, fearing that if I slowed down, they would see how embarrassed I was. But Calvin pulled me into an adjoining lounge, almost forcefully holding me in his arms. "Calm down, nah. Calm down," he said, with a heavy tone, trying to ease my heart. "It was an accident. She fell into my arms, and there's nothing between us. Nothing at all." I was speechless. Nothing at all? Then what about everything that's happened lately? Calvin, don't you think you should keep your distance from Cher? She's just your ex-girlfriend, yet you let her cross boundaries again and again. It was probably the first time I showed him my vulnerable side. He seemed taken aback, then chuckled softly. "You idiot," he said. "You finally said what's been on your mind. I thought you didn't care at all, seeing you so calm." His words left me frozen. "What do you mean?" I asked. Calvin looked at me gently and raised his hand to pinch my nose. "For all these years you've been with me, your emotions have been so rare that I wondered if you really liked me. I've been waiting to see an expression from you other than calmness." Before he could finish speaking, I understood. Calvin had been provoking me. He had intentionally allowed Cher to get close, ignoring my feelings as his girlfriend, just to see a reaction from me. I didn't know how to process that feeling. Calvin said he hadn't cared about Cher for a long time, and I should have been happy, but instead I felt the absurdity of it all. He knew how much it hurt me, yet he still chose to act recklessly. Warm breaths grazed my ear as Calvin gently kissed my lips, his gaze filled with seriousness. "All right, I promise you. I'll make it clear to her that I won't have any more contact with her. Please don't be angry. Forgive me." He promised to make up for my birthday, and I agreed, deciding to give him a chance. But after that day, I often wondered if Calvin had known what would happen next. Would he have regretted what he said to me? On my birthday, Calvin's attempt to make it up to me wasn't over. Another call came in on his phone, and after he answered it, his expression suddenly changed. He quickly put on his coat and walked out of the restaurant. The thunder outside struck with such force that it felt like a hammer to my heart. I felt a heaviness in my chest and rushed to follow him. "Calvin," I called his name twice before he turned to explain, his face anxious as if he'd lost all control. Cher had an accident. I was stunned, my fingers instinctively curling. Even though I hadn't spoken, Calvin's patience was clearly gone. He sighed deeply and said, "Nina, I know you don't want me to see her, but something happened to Cher. She has no family or friends here, only me. I can't ignore her." My face drained of color, and I spoke uncertainly. "I just wanted to ask if I could." Calvin then realized something was wrong and softened his tone. "You don't need to come. Take a taxi home. I'll go to the hospital to see to her and then come back to you." He slammed the door behind him, stepping into the night, leaving me standing there, feeling as if someone had ripped open my heart. I still went to the hospital, and when I found the room, I saw Cher curled up in Calvin's arms, sobbing uncontrollably. "Breaking up with you was never my choice. I had no option, Calvin. If I hadn't agreed, my father would have forced me to marry an old man. But now I can finally escape and come back to you, to love you properly. Yet you won't even see me. Don't you want me anymore?" I watched the scene, seeing Calvin just let Cher hold him, his eyes filled with internal conflict and pain. After hesitating for a long while, he finally embraced her, his heart clearly aching. "Why didn't you tell me this before?" he asked. Cher cried even harder. "If I tell you the truth now, will you leave Mina and be with me again?" Her question struck to the heart. Calvin closed his eyes, saying nothing. Silence often speaks volumes, and I stood frozen, my heart aching as the pain inside me grew stronger. A nurse came over, and as I stepped aside, my legs weak and barely holding me up, I leaned against the wall. The two of them, lost in their emotions, finally noticed me. Calvin paused, as if waking from a dream, pushed Cher away, and walked toward me in the hallway, blocking my way. "Nina, what are you doing here?" he asked, helplessly draping his coat over my shoulders. "Didn't I tell you to go home and wait for me?" At that moment, I didn't know what kind of expression to give him. I tried to suppress the tremor in my voice as I said, "Calvin, Cher is not a good person. Her intentions in keeping you are not pure. Otherwise, why would she wait until your company is successful again to return? Why didn't she come back earlier or later?" I paused. "You know, Cher's an adult. She can choose to call the police, and even her parents can't force her to do anything. She left because your family lost power, and she didn't want to be with you." Calvin seemed pained, and the concern from before vanished, replaced with anger. He interrupted me sharply. "Enough. What right do you have to speak about Cher?" His eyes burned with rage as he looked down at me. "After all these years, did you really like me? You never opened your heart to me. When you came to me after what happened at my house, wasn't it because you knew my family would rise again? You just wanted to wait for an opportunity, didn't you? Don't think you're so noble. Compared to Cher, how much better are you?" The weight of his words crushed me. Looking at Calvin's familiar face, I saw disgust and disappointment written across it. Memories of the past felt like sharp knives cutting into my heart, piece by piece. I tried to remain calm, but my voice trembled. Calvin, don't forget, it was you who said you wanted to be with me. You pursued me. You promised to treat me well for a lifetime. Yet now, did he think of me like this? Did he think I had some ulterior motive for being by his side? Calvin froze, realizing the gravity of his words. He opened his lips as if to apologize, but the phone rang, and seeing the caller's number, he had no choice but to walk away. Anyway, you go home first, he said, and left. I'll talk to you later, he said hurriedly before rushing away, as though trying to escape. I carefully folded his coat and placed it in the hallway. My limbs completely forgotten, swept away by the pain. My hands shook uncontrollably, unaware of how I had descended the stairs. As I exited the hospital, the cold rain hit my face, and I slowly regained my senses. I realized it had been raining outside for quite a while, but it paled in comparison to the storm inside my heart. Numb, I pulled out my phone and called a taxi. The phone buzzed. It was a text from Calvin. I'm sorry. Please wait for me downstairs. I'll come back with you. I glanced at the message with indifference, as if all emotion had faded from me. After a brief pause, I raised my hand and edited the message. Calvin, let's break up. As soon as I sent it, something suddenly covered my mouth and nose, and a powerful force pushed me out. I lost consciousness. When I woke up again, I found myself staring into a pair of dark eyes, and a wicked grin appeared. Awake, our famous Calvin's girlfriend? I froze. The person before me was someone I recognized, Jason. He had once joked at a class reunion about how I was desperately pursuing Calvin. I almost forgot. He had also been one of Cher's obsessed admirers in college. My head ached and felt heavy. Groggy, I looked around. The light was dim, and several men with menacing expressions stood nearby. A camera light was on, making their intentions obvious. What kind of trash are you to dare compete with Cher for someone? Jason sneered. Wasn't Calvin arrogant back then? We weren't the only ones to step on the Leo family, but this guy's been obsessed with the Sue family. Today, I'll play with this woman and see if he can still act so cocky in the future. Taking advantage of the lingering effects of the drug in my body, a group of them approached with sinister smiles, ripping at my clothes. The cold air pierced my skin, and Jason, holding a dagger, threatened me with it at my waist, thinking I would be scared. Remember, you mustn't talk about today, or else. Before he could finish, I suddenly grabbed his wrist with a bit of regained strength and gave him a small smile, meeting his increasingly nervous expression. Since you like Cher so much, how about you take on a murder case for her? I didn't give him a chance to respond and lunged straight at the dagger. The sharp blade instantly pierced my abdomen, and chaos erupted in the room. I can't believe it. Someone's dead. Damn it. Is this woman crazy? I don't want to go to jail. The lights and shadows before me became chaotic, and the sounds around me blurred. Old memories, like a revolving lantern, slowly crept into my mind. I remembered Calvin's confession in front of the hospital during a rainy night, where he held me and cried bitterly. Again, I was reminded of my high school years when I had just recovered from a long illness. The hormones had caused me to gain so much weight that I was bullied by the boys at school. My parents had divorced when I was young, and they both thought I was an orphan, which only fueled their bullying. They dragged me to the school rooftop, shoved me around, insulted me with cruel words, and attacked me with fists and feet. I gritted my teeth and stubbornly resisted, but my body still hurt so much, just like now. There were moments when I truly thought I might die. Perhaps I couldn't hang on much longer, but someone broke through the crowd and rushed over, holding me tightly in their arms. The embrace was warm, like it could soothe my soul. "Are you okay?" the person asked. My memories and reality tangled together as I opened my eyes, struggling to focus on the face before me. But it wasn't the person from my memories. "Nah, are you okay?" I muttered, then completely passed out. When I came to, I was in the hospital, surrounded by busy doctors, nurses, and a few young police officers who were waiting to take statements. They categorized the situation as attempted rape. The police asked me about the entire incident and then offered me words of comfort. "Miss Na, thank you for your cooperation. Please take care of your injuries. The case will be resolved soon." After they left, I looked at the person standing by the door. He was dressed in a sharp suit, his handsome face carrying a hint of exhaustion. Before my parents divorced, there had been an older brother figure from the house next door, a senior at the business school during my university years. His name was Sean. I hadn't seen him in years and never imagined our reunion would happen under such circumstances. My voice was rough as I spoke. "Is it you who saved me?" Sean got up from beside the door and walked over, gently rubbing my head. "You've been asleep for 3 days. When we brought you to the hospital, the doctor said the dagger was less than half an inch from your liver. If it had been any deeper, you wouldn't have made it." His voice became hoarse as he spoke, his eyes full of emotion. "It's only been 3 years since we last met, kid. How did things end up like this?" "Kid." Only Sean ever called me that. During my senior year, Sean had returned to our alma mater, and after recognizing my abilities, he had offered me a high-paying job several times to join his company in City H. At that time, I was too focused on lifting Calvin's spirits to consider his offer. Now, I shamelessly looked at the neighbor who had once taken such good care of me. "Sean, you said I was always welcome to go to City H. Does that still hold true?" Sean seemed surprised for a moment, then a bright, clean smile appeared at the corners of his lips. "Of course, if you change your mind, I'd be more than happy." The police had said the case would be resolved soon, but I couldn't wait any longer. After resting in the hospital for half a day, I ignored the doctor's objections and completed the discharge procedures. I had Sean wait downstairs for me. After changing my clothes and leaving the room, I unexpectedly ran into Calvin in the hallway, just a few steps away. I looked at the man I once knew so well, but all I felt now was disorientation. It turned out he had been with Cher in the hospital all these days. Deep emotions surged within me, but they were no longer as intense as before. I realized that my feelings for Calvin had diminished. His eyes were red, and his chin was covered with stubble. The person who once cared the most about his appearance was now completely disheveled. He rushed over to me, taking 2 steps at a time, and grabbed my hand tightly. "You finally agreed to see me. 3 days ago, you just dropped the breakup bomb and vanished, not coming home. I couldn't reach you by phone. Nah, were you trying to make me anxious on purpose?" A sharp pain suddenly shot through my abdomen, a lingering ache from the surgery. I parted my lips, wanting to speak, but before I could, Calvin suddenly shook off my hand, causing me to stumble. He gritted his teeth in frustration and anger. "Nina, you know very well that Cher was injured in a car accident, and her family is abroad. There's no one to take care of her except me. Yet, you insist on holding on to this and making unreasonable demands at a time like this." My elbow hit the wall, intensifying the pain throughout my body. I looked up at Calvin. If just a second ago I had thought he still cared about my disappearance, that absurd thought vanished in this instant. After all these years of love, it still hurt. Breathing felt difficult, yet the words I spoke came out calmly. "Calvin, I'm not being unreasonable when I say I want to break up. I mean it." Calvin's breath caught as he stared at me, incredulous. "Do you even realize what you're saying?" I didn't speak again. I just coldly watched him. In the 3 years we had been together, we had our fair share of conflicts, both big and small, but I had never acted irrationally or suggested breaking up. Calvin quickly realized that I was serious. His body swayed slightly, lost and flustered, as if trying to placate me. "I was wrong. I admit it. Nah, as soon as Sherry is discharged, I'll cut all ties with her. But can you not make breaking up such a big deal? It's my fault. Please forgive me." "Okay? Or are you saying you never liked me at all?" The warmth in my heart faded layer by layer, and I realized that Calvin had always kept getting tangled up in this issue. I initially believed that he cared about me to some degree, but I now realize that it was simply his way of dealing with his own mistakes. He acted toward Cher with spite, unable to move on from her, and repeatedly hurt me as if a single sentence could somehow win my tender heart. I closed my eyes and took a slow, deep breath. When I spoke again, my posture was upright, and my heart had already calmed. "Calvin, I used to really like you. You think that I approached you back then to play some long game and catch a big fish. But what you didn't know was that I had liked you even before college for many years." Calvin was shocked. In my sophomore year, I was bullied by older boys on the rooftop because of my weight. When my head hit the wall, I almost lost consciousness. It was Calvin who suddenly showed up, drove those boys off, rescued me, and took me to the infirmary. When my parents divorced and I fell ill, that was when I first experienced the kindness of a stranger. I couldn't stop myself from crying at that moment. At 16, Calvin was so bright and kind. He saw the scars on my wrists and spoke gently as he reassured me, telling me that getting sick wasn't my fault, being overweight wasn't my fault, and being abandoned by my parents wasn't my fault. I was the one who had suffered from all the misfortune around me, and no one had the right to accuse me. The aggression they showed me was a sign of their poor upbringing, and eventually they would pay for their wrongdoings. So don't cry, don't be sad. You've already gone through those tough times with illness. As long as you live well, there will still be hope, right? That day in the medical room, with the smell of disinfectant in the air, Calvin's smile shone like a ray of light, repeatedly pulling me from the depths of despair. Afterward, I studied hard, lost weight, skipped grades, and worked to get into the same school as Calvin, putting myself in a position much closer to him. But then I found out Cher was already by his side, and it seemed like he had forgotten all about me. I swallowed my bitterness. Those years I spent by your side, when everyone mocked me as your crazy admirer, I never once thought about being with you. Your feelings for Cher were so deep. I just couldn't stand to see you so hopeless, so I spoke to you. Do you remember? Calvin seemed lost in thought, suddenly remembering something. His face turned pale, and he froze. His color drained away. The words I had said to him were the same words he had once used to comfort me in high school. Calvin was startled, his voice breaking as tears welled up in his eyes. He reached for my hand, but I carefully pulled away. Back then, you saved me, and I loved you for so many years. I said softly, almost to myself, Calvin, even now. Calvin shook his head, unwilling to give up, still wanting to speak, but I interrupted him with a question. Calvin, was that text you sent me 3 nights ago, asking me to wait for you, really from you? Calvin seemed confused, momentarily unsure. What text message? He asked. I nodded, no longer concerned with him, and before leaving the hospital, I told him, it's okay, you'll know soon enough. Yes, the evil one. I never intended to let her go. That night, I flew to City H with Sean. Sean bought his ticket almost immediately, probably fearing that I would get entangled with others and worrying about my injuries worsening. The police investigation and case report probably reached Calvin and Cher around the same time. Later, while I was recovering, Sean told me, you have no idea. The police told Calvin every little detail about the case, and he almost lost his mind. He wanted to find you, but couldn't. The police refused to release any information, so he turned his anger on Cherie. When the police arrived later, Calvin was choking Cher, nearly suffocating her. I muttered to myself, I'm crazy. I've gone crazy because of how you treated me. Sean vividly recounted everything. When he turned back to see me flipping through a magazine, he raised an eyebrow. Why didn't you react to what you just heard? He asked. What kind of reaction should there be? I replied, emotionless. Once I truly loved Calvin and gave him my heart without hesitation. In just a few days, Calvin managed to destroy the deep feelings and companionship that had built up over 10 years. At that time, teetering on the edge of life and death, I thought I would never be able to forgive Calvin. But now I hear all about his remorse and pain from Sean. And yet, there isn't a single ripple in my heart. Sean, looking bored, suddenly asked, what are your plans after your injury heals? I put down the magazine and wearily looked at him. You don't expect me to jump back into work right away, do you? Sean chuckled. How is that possible? I just wanted to know your thoughts. His expression became serious. You've been tired for so many years. It's time to properly relax. Thinking about it, I realized that after all these years of helping Calvin with his comeback, I had been stuck in an endless cycle of work. I hadn't taken a proper breath. After a moment of silent reflection, I decided to take a trip to Yunnan to see the Listening Flower Valley, a place I had long wanted to visit. I once thought I would have a romantic wedding with Calvin there, but now I was the only one going. Sean didn't suggest joining me, probably because he had his own things to do. What I didn't know was that after I left, Sean returned to City A and met with Calvin. Calvin is very sharp. He found out from the police that it was Sean who had saved me that day, and immediately connected the dots between Sean and me. After all, I hadn't made many friends over the years, and Sean was one of the few. When Calvin saw Sean, he looked so worn out, his face almost unrecognizable, his eyes filled with despair. You always wanted to take Nina away from me, didn't you? Did you hide her? Sean, always with a calm demeanor, looked at Calvin and said, Nina is not anyone's possession. Please be careful with your words. Calvin's anger flared instantly. His jaw clenched. Stop pretending. Don't think I don't know what you're up to with Nina. You definitely know where she is. Calvin had been frantically investigating, but had found nothing useful. A living person couldn't just disappear. The only explanation was that someone had erased their traces. As he thought about this, he glared at Sean with hatred. Sean remained indifferent, adjusting his glasses. So what, Calvin? This is your doing. The pain in Calvin's eyes intensified, but Sean coldly and calmly added, Do you know Nina has depression? Calvin's breathing became erratic. Depression? Sean nodded. Yes, when she was 11, her parents divorced, and although she acted unaffected, she was already at the breaking point. The year she graduated from middle school, she fell seriously ill. Her parents left her with medical expenses but wouldn't care for her in the hospital. That was when she first thought about ending her life. Later, she met you. When she spoke about you to me, I saw a glimmer of light in her eyes for the first time, and her tone became cheerful. That's when I felt jealous that she had the courage to keep going because of someone. Later, after you broke up with Cher, I saw Nina dutifully stay by your side. I tried more than once to get her to come with me, but she refused. She was determined to stay with you no matter what. She skipped 2 grades. People thought she was clever, but she wasn't. Her illness and chemotherapy dulled her thinking and reactions. After enduring trials that most people couldn't bear, she finally earned the right to stand by your side. So to put it simply, she's just stubborn and foolish, relentless until she gets what she wants. Sean's voice grew heavy. But you've let her down. The day she had her accident, I had just returned to City A. I took a taxi when I saw her contact, and I couldn't believe it. But coincidences like this do happen. As soon as I got to the hospital, I saw her being taken away by a group of people and forced into a van. That night, in the pouring rain, I chased the car while calling the police. When I arrived at the club, Jason and his group were trying to take revenge on her. Do you know? It was Nina who voluntarily walked toward the knife. She peeled away the bloody truth piece by piece in front of Calvin. Sean stared at him, almost cruelly, and asked, "What do you think she was thinking at that moment?" Calvin stood there, dazed, as if all his resolve had shattered in an instant, burdened by a weight of unbearable life. "Let her go, Calvin. You don't deserve her." I returned to the city after my week-long trip, dragging my suitcase. As soon as I arrived, I saw Calvin standing by the door. The moment he saw me, his eyes turned red, and he dropped the cigarette from his hand. "Nina, so much has happened. Why didn't you tell me?" I was taken aback. Calvin used to never smoke. "I was deceived by Cher," he continued, "and I had no idea what she was doing behind my back with my phone. I wanted to contact you. I wanted to apologize to you in person, but I couldn't find you. I've had a headache thinking about it." I interrupted him coldly. "You don't need to apologize to me. The main responsibility doesn't lie with you. Besides, I've already made it clear to you that we're even." With that, I tried to walk past him to open the door, but he suddenly stumbled forward, grabbing my suitcase. He probably intended to take my hand, but hesitated for some reason. His voice was almost pleading. "Nina, let's get back together, okay? I know I was wrong. Whether you believe it or not, I admit I was selfish at the start with Cher. I wanted revenge for what she did to me. Seeing her upset because of me gave me some satisfaction, but that wasn't love. I regret my impulsive actions. Can't we get back together? I promise I'll make it up to you." Calvin cried out. I looked at his tears, but found it hard to understand. Just like when he allowed Cher to cross lines and provoke me. I sighed and brushed his hand away. "I'm sorry, Calvin. I can't do it. I've lost count of how many times he's apologized, but he doesn't understand that some wounds can heal, while others never will. Every time someone mentions his name, I think of that rainy night, the accusations he made against me, and the revenge Jason took on me that night. Calvin says Cher needs him, but she only suffered minor injuries. Still, she took all his attention, even making him turn and blame me. I nearly lost my life, and on that day, my birthday, when he promised to stay with me, where was he? I know Calvin's abilities. If he really cared about me, he could have found me easily during my coma in the hospital. But he didn't. Why? Because he was enjoying the role of hero with Cher, basking in the pleasure of seeing her. The woman who once abandoned him, now dependent on him. He couldn't let go of her, whether in the past or present, whether in love or not. His thoughts have always been fully devoted to Cher. He paused for a second longer before turning off his phone. Cher and I are already a thing of the past. Don't take it personally. I'll handle this matter. Calvin's eyes held indescribable pain and despair. Is there really no way for us to be together? I didn't say anything more, but he saw the answer in my eyes. Crying uncontrollably, I thought, I can understand even less. I was the one almost violated, the one who almost lost my life, the one whose heart was trampled upon. Yet he cried as though he was the most wronged person in the world. Finally he left, clenching his fist. Fine, I respect your decision. I won't bother you, but those who hurt you will pay. Soon after, I heard from Sean how Calvin sent Cher to prison and destroyed the Shen and Su families. But none of that mattered to me anymore. Sean asked if I was truly done looking back. The answer is obvious. Sometimes we come together, and sometimes we part. But for the rest of our lives, may we each find our own happiness.